By way of introduction, I'm Dr. Stephen Galatas, and I teach political science at SFA. It's a pleasure, like you have heard from the rest of our speakers and moderators, to welcome you to this session. We're glad that you're attending this conference. We are glad that some of our SFA students have joined us today, too, and we thank you for their participation. And we've had alumni from SFA as well who've been in the audience at various times, and so we're glad that they are there. And some of our colleagues who are not on the panel from various segments of the university have come to join us today as well, so thank you for your interest in this program too. I'm a veteran of 4 of these now. This is my 4th time to participate. I've been at all of the conferences that we've done on the various topics, and we're excited that this one is turning out to be the success that it is as well, following up on the successes we've had at the prior 3 conferences. We're going to begin today this session, and this session is to focus on the security dimension of relations, trans-Pacific relations, and the security relationship in Asia. Joining us today to start this panel is Dr. Robert Hathaway. He has been director of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. as the program director for Asia. Prior to that, he had served 12 years on the professional staff of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives with a focus on Asia. He has also been a member of the history staff of the Central Intelligence Agency and taught at George Washington University, as well as Barnhart, Middlebury, and Wilson Colleges. He has a doctorate in American diplomatic history from the University of North Carolina, and has authored several books, including his most recent book, New Security Challenges in Asia. Please welcome Dr. Robert Hathaway.
Well, I want to start out by echoing the comments of many of the other participants by thanking SFA, thanking Dean Murphy, thanking Dixie Grohl for putting this together, but also thanking all of you in the audience. It wouldn't be much fun if we came here and there was nobody to talk to and to listen to. So I look forward to getting to that part of the panel as well. I want to talk for a few minutes this morning about security trend lines in Asia. Both recent trend lines, but also trying to project a bit into the future, though I'm frankly not very good at seeing the future. Maybe you can help me out on that. In important respects, the security environment in Asia has deteriorated over the past decade. 10 years ago, China and the 10 ASEAN countries had recently signed an accord that provided that the signatories would resolve their territorial disputes by peaceful means and exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities that might affect regional peace and security. Today, both the Philippines and Vietnam are locked in potentially dangerous confrontations with China over disputed islands and waters in the South China Sea. And Southeast Asia is a contentious site of competing claims and ambitions. 10 years ago, China and Japan were growing rapidly, and China would soon trade between China and Japan was growing rapidly, and China would soon become Japan's largest trading partner. Today, relations between China and Japan have plummeted because of their competing territorial claims in the East China Sea, and naval vessels and warplanes of the two countries regularly engage in a dangerous game of chicken. 10 years ago, the 3rd round of the 6-party talks over North Korea's nuclear weapons program had been held and would lead the following year to an agreement in which North Korea pledged to shut down its nuclear weapons program and to rejoin the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Since then, North Korea has tested nuclear weapons for the first time, made significant advances in its ballistic missile program, and attacked a South Korean naval vessel and shelled a South Korean army outpost, in both instances killing South Korea soldiers. 10 years ago in Afghanistan, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had been routed, and the level of fighting there diminished to such an extent that the Bush administration had a year earlier redirected its military activities away from Afghanistan and toward Iraq. Today, the war in Afghanistan continues. American soldiers are still dying, and many doubt the ability of the new Kabul government to defeat the Taliban or to prevent the reoccurrence of civil war. Today, strategic rivalry between China and the United States is increased to the point where many in both countries publicly speak of the other as an adversary, even an enemy. And today, tensions between South Korea and Japan, America's two principal allies in the region, have skyrocketed to the point where the top leaders of the two countries cannot even talk to one another unless President Obama personally orchestrates the meeting. So, quite clearly, Asia is a more dangerous place than it seemed 10 years ago. Last year, for the first time in centuries, Asia spent more than Europe on arms. Fortunately, not all the news is discouraging. When I used to give these talks about 10 years ago about likely Asian flashpoints, I would generally focus on three specific areas of concern: cross-strait relations between China and Taiwan, the divided Korean Peninsula, and the enduring hostility between Pakistan and India. And here the news is rather good. Although none of these flashpoints have been diffused, neither have they blown us up over the last decade. Indeed, in all three cases, notwithstanding firing across the line of control between Pak and Kashmir just this week, notwithstanding what we heard just earlier this morning about North Korea shooting down balloons sent over from South Korea. Notwithstanding these and other things, most analysts believe that the chances of a full-scale conflict in any of these three areas are much less likely today than a decade ago. So it's not all dreary. In fact, what many Asian analysts most worry about is not a deliberate decision for war, but an unpremeditated, accidental war. And here, the biggest risk of accidental hostilities in Asia would seem to be an incident caused by over-aggressive Chinese ships or jet fighters playing chicken with U.S. or Japanese or other ships or aircraft in the East and South China Seas. This is not simply a hypothetical concern, of course. At least some of you in this room will remember that in 2001, an overconfident Chinese fighter pilot accidentally ran into an American reconnaissance plane, killing himself and causing the American plane to make an emergency landing in China, where it and its crew were held for about 11 days before they were released. Apparently, Beijing has not learned from this episode. A couple of months ago, a Chinese fighter came within 20 feet of a U.S. Navy plane flying at more than 400 miles per hour. So there are some alarming trends, but also, same token, some encouraging developments over the last 10 years. I think we need to recognize, however, that Asia faces and poses other types of threats than these traditional geopolitical security threats, other types of threats that are almost certainly going to loom larger in our calculations in the years ahead. We had a bit of reference to them both yesterday and this morning, and because of time, I'm not going to spell them out in great detail, but let me put some of these new types of threats on the table, because I think as we try to peer into the future, we ought particularly to recognize that the nature of the security challenges Asia poses is changing, has changed, in some ways dramatically. What do I mean? Throughout history, diplomats and national security managers have thought of security primarily in geopolitical, state-centered terms. Threats have customarily been seen as emanating from others' threats. Implicit or explicit coercion, generally of a military or an economic nature, has usually been involved. And military power has been regarded as the essential guarantor of a state's security. Balance of power, alliance management, deterrence, preemptive force, and similar concepts have dominated discussions about security. They're still important. I just suggested that we have many of these same concerns. But nonetheless, the nature of security challenges has, it seems to me, dramatically changed and expanded. And I think that's the key word, expanded, in recent years to include such new or non-traditional threats as refugee flows, terrorism, particularly by non-state actors, natural disasters, extreme weather, food shortages and food security, water security, energy security, natural resource competition, viruses that, if not contained, can cause pandemics. I refer you to SARS, avian flu, and in the worst case scenario today, Ebola. Cyber terrorism, cyber vandalism, both by states and by non-state actors. Again, this is not to suggest that traditional geopolitical threats have disappeared, but I think that we also have to take note of the fact that we're likely to be increasingly influenced by, and your lives are likely to be increasingly shaped by, these non-traditional security challenges. Now, this isn't just something that I've made up in the last 30 minutes. During a trip earlier this year to Indonesia, Secretary of State Carrie spoke of climate change as, quote, a weapon of mass destruction. We used to say there's 3 types of WMDs: nukes, chemical, and biological weapons. Well, now, according to the Secretary of State, climate change is also a weapon of mass destruction. The director of the FBI, who ought to know something about threats, has warned that cyber attacks that could cause a nuclear meltdown or disrupt the financial infrastructure of this country, or blind air traffic controllers, or fry power grids, that cyber attacks are likely to eclipse terrorism as the most serious menace to the United States in the years ahead. Admiral Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior-most military official in the United States, has said that cyber attacks pose an existential threat that could, quote, bring us to our knees. The Economist has quoted an unnamed senior U.S. official to the effect that a cyber attack on the United States that would make 9/11 look like a tea party is only a matter of time, will occur. The only question is when. Well, we're here to talk about Asia, though. You might say, well, it's global warming, our cyber attacks, are these other types of non-traditional security challenges, specifically Asian threats? Indeed, they are. First, because Asia is affected by them, in some cases profoundly. At the extreme end of this, a number of Asian countries are literally sinking below the rising seawaters and may very well not exist by the end of this century. But Asia is also the home to, in some cases, the cause of, in many cases, the contributor to many of these threats. Greenhouse gases. China has surpassed the United States to become the #1 producer of greenhouse gases. India is the world's third largest producer. Asia is the home to huge refugee flows that can destabilize governments, to viruses that, if left unchecked, can lead to pandemics, to individuals and groups and probably even governments who are working to hack into the computer networks of other countries, including the United States. Now, what's different about these threats as opposed to the traditional geopolitical threats that we generally think about is that with these types of threats, the words victory and defeat, the meaning of those words are less obvious. Traditional military power is largely irrelevant to confront these threats. Nationalist-based solutions and unilateral actions are inadequate to counter these threats. Zero-sum thinking between two countries or two blocks of countries is not only meaningless, it's counterproductive. Fortunately, there are lots of common sense, which is not to say easy, but common sense things the world can do, the United States can do, to guard against both the traditional and the newer non-traditional threats that I've mentioned. I only have about 2 more minutes, but let me just set out 3 or 4 or 5 ideas that perhaps we can develop during discussion. Clearly, this isn't the only ideas, but there are obvious things we need to be doing, and we need to be doing now. Let's go back to one of the traditional threats, North Korea. Generally, we focus on North Korea's nuclear weapons. But there's another and probably an even more likely threat North Korea poses, and that's its sudden collapse. Now, we've been talking for years, even for decades, about the collapse of the Kim family dynasty and the collapse of the regime, and it hadn't happened. And I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, and I don't think it's going to happen next year, but I'm absolutely convinced it'll happen, and we probably won't have much lead time knowing when it's going to happen. We should be thinking about this now, but more to the point, we should be talking to the Chinese about this now. Someone's going to go in and try to secure those nuclear weapons. There's going to be massive chaos, huge refugee flows, and most likely, both from the south across the DMZ, the South Koreans and perhaps the United States are going to move north, and equally likely the Chinese are going to come across their border, if for no other reason than to try to impose some stability. You could have a situation where you've got the PLA and U.S. military eyeball to eyeball. This might be very dangerous. We should be planning for this collapse now. The Chinese don't want to talk about it. They don't want to even give any sort of legitimacy to the idea that the Kim regime may not last forever. But we need to be talking about it before it happens. South China and East China Seas. We need to negotiate and enforce, or implement and enforce, codes of conduct, just as the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated during the Cold War, to minimize the likelihood that you'll have some reckless pilot, some careless ship official creating a real dangerous situation in or above these contested waters. Codes of conduct, guidelines. Ships have to stay X number of miles or yards or feet or meters apart. Planes have to stay apart. Establish military, not simply political, but military hotlines. So if there is a crisis or a confrontation or an accident, people can immediately get on the phone and talk about it. 3, briefly, ideas what to do to begin to deal with some of these new types of non-traditional challenges. First, and in some ways most importantly, I think we have to reconceptualize the notion of security. What we mean by security, what are the demands of security? A much broader definition of security. I think we need to rethink traditional ideas on national sovereignty, state autonomy. Most of these non-traditional security threats do not lend themselves to resolution simply by the actions of single states. You may well have to take actions which would violate traditional notions about sovereignty or autonomy. And lastly, and this pertains, I think, first of all to the U.S. government, but I think it's also relevant to Asian governments, we have to reorient the U.S. national security budget to deal with these new threats. Today, this is true in the United States, it's true in China, it's true throughout the region. The budgets are overwhelmingly geared to countering traditional types of threats. But if we don't start putting money, much more money, into thinking about, planning for, and staving off the most serious of these new types of threats, we're far more likely to be having to face them in real time. So, just some ideas. I've got some others. We want to talk about them, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hathaway. It's also now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carrie Currier. She holds a master's and doctorate degrees from the University of Arizona, and she's currently on faculty at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. She teaches courses on Asian politics, comparative politics more broadly, feminist international relations theory, and global political economy. Her research has been on economic reform in China, China's foreign policies, including its foreign policies in the Middle East, and its global strategies to pursue energy and other resources. She has also conducted extensive work on the status of women in many of these countries. And she also serves currently as the director of the Asia Studies program at TCU and is on the Women's Studies Advisory Committee. She has served on the board of the Southwest Asian Studies program and is incoming secretary for the Western Political Science Association. And she has served on the Feminist Theory Gender Studies section of the International Studies Association. Welcome to our panel today.
Thank you. They always say the longer your bio is, the more important you're trying to make yourself seem. I think my bio is the longest one in the program. I do want to apologize because I over-caffeinate about this time of day, and so I may speak a little quickly, and so I will try to stay to my script in order to make it manageable in terms of the speed at which I'm going to talk. So I would like to note and start off by saying that I think it's really appropriate that this panel on security is between the panels that deal with governance and the economy, because I think it serves as a nice bridge to some of the issues that I see occurring in the Asian region. More particularly in looking at security, I see some of the issues being both economically motivated and then also relating to the issues of maintaining a sense of political legitimacy. So I think at this point, we know the general background to security issues in Asia. We've heard from various panelists that have talked and sort of set the stage for us. And what I'd like to do is kind of answer really all of the questions that were set forth for us by our panel organizer, and to look at really four things. One is the fears about the rise of China. So my area of expertise is generally on China, and so I want to look deeper at sort of these fears about the rise of China and what it means for security in the region. I also want to look at sort of China's foreign policy goals as well, because I think one of the things that we learned from yesterday's conversation is that it's important for us to sort of understand and look at the world from the other's eyes in order to fully understand the implications of how they approach foreign policy. I also want to look at energy issues. I think energy, particularly in dealing with China's efforts or aggressive or more assertive stance in the South China Sea, is an area that we haven't yet had a chance to talk quite yet about. And then finally look at what this means for the future, so if we can sort of speculate forward. It's a pretty ambitious agenda for 20 minutes, so we'll see what happens. But as I already mentioned, we have looked at some of the issues in Asia, and one of the things that I wanted to kind of reiterate is there generally seems to be this regular skepticism when it comes to looking at the actions or activities of both China and Japan, right? Either independently or in their interactions with each other. And so I would agree that things have grown a lot more tense, particularly in the situation in the East and the South China Seas when it comes to China. And it's really not surprising that many of the issues really revolve around this perceived rise of China and a seemingly more aggressive posture that it takes. So since my own research focuses on China and its pursuit of energy security and the arms trade in the Middle East, one of the things to sort of learn from these is how we can look at general trends that extend not just in Asia, but sort of across the world, and looking at how China is perceived. So I want to situate things kind of in the realm of Chinese foreign policy, basically get us to know a little bit more about China. So while one of the speakers yesterday reminded us that the U.S. relationship with China is no longer in a Cold War kind of mentality, in which I would agree, right? We don't have sort of this bipolar world of us versus them. In spite of that, though, the idea hasn't really faded quickly in terms of our rhetoric or actions taken by the United States with regard to China. And so there's a lot of discussion about this rise of China, the fear of China, which is presented really as a zero-sum game, as my colleague had suggested. And so it's this question about how we can reevaluate this. Now, this is not to justify or defend Chinese actions, but just to kind of give us a sense of a different perspective in which they approach the situation. So is China rising? Of course. The question is, does it really pose a threat? And if so, to whom? And what is that perceived threat? So first, I think it's important to dispel the myth of a threat from a rising China. The United States and others are quick to engage in what we might consider to be mirror imaging, right? We assume that our adversaries will engage in the same kinds of ways that we would. So when it comes to foreign policy analysis, we have to try to, again, understand that other. So if we look at the world and try to understand perhaps that it's not just set up in realpolitik terms, not set up in ways that are focused on power politics, what I would argue is that we really have to look deeper at what China presents. China's defense is not as sophisticated as we want to believe. They do have a literal navy, they have an aircraft carrier, and they are increasing defense spending. But the United States also has a large naval presence in the region. China does not have the full accompaniment required for a full functioning aircraft carrier fleet. And of course, they spend a very small fraction compared to what the United States spends militarily. Depending on whose numbers you use, when you look at US military defense spending, it ranges between around 48-ish% to 50% of all global military spending. So if you put all of the other countries in the world combined, they spend about the same as the United States does. So that's, of course, formal spending, and there are ways that we can look deeper into those statistics and numbers to suggest that maybe that's not the whole story. China has declared that it has no interest in engaging in expansionist behavior or of achieving hegemony. And you might argue that the claims in the South China Sea are not about engaging in expansionist behavior of acquiring new territory. Now, of course, that's a controversial statement, so I'll leave that with you there. China does have domestic economic problems as well that keep it from being a real threat to the United States. There are a wide range of issues that it's dealing with in terms of health issues, social safety nets, urban and rural divides, shadow banking, energy, and many of these can threaten to undermine the stability of the Chinese state. And these are greater security interests in many cases to the Chinese. This doesn't stop the United States or the West from trying to contain or place limits on China's growth or pursuit of interests. And this is where we can see general patterns that have emerged beyond just the Asian sphere. So if you look at how China has interacted in other areas of the world, if you're looking at its increased presence in the Middle East, if you're looking at the increased presence that it's had in Africa, it's been met with a great deal of skepticism. China's reach has spread, and the United States has responded to each instance. So in many cases, it's not about this new pivot or rebalancing to Asia, as we've talked about. You know, the pivot and the rebalancing hasn't been a real pivot yet. China's responding to things regarding aspects of containment, and it has been able to, it has tried to push back on efforts to limit its power overseas. So if we look at China's foreign policy perspective to see how the Chinese view the world, there are three kind of key objectives to look at in terms of foreign policy goals. The first two are pretty obvious, which is to maintain a sense of state sovereignty, right? So China's concerned about maintaining and upholding the policy of sovereignty. In addition, and this is not an overt goal, but there is an effort to resist U.S. hegemony, but never to seek hegemony. So the Chinese have declared, and again, whether you believe that or not, that they will never seek hegemony. The third one to look at is this effort to become a responsible stakeholder in the international community. And so there has been a great deal of pressure on China to become more of a responsible stakeholder. They have seen themselves as a champion of developing world interests. They've been involved in international organizations. They have tried to play by the rules for the most part, which is something, as we talked about yesterday, the United States can't always say that it does. And so I would argue that these things are indication of more of a, let's call it constructivist or neoliberal approach to looking at the world, and not more in that realist kind of sense of looking at the world, looking at the power of institutions and global norms that can help shape behavior. So underlying all of this, though, I would argue, is this effort to maintain a sense of state legitimacy. So this means having to keep up economic growth in order to avoid social instability. So in the sense, we can argue that the governance stability is really one of the key issues underlying China's seemingly more assertive posture in the region and perhaps throughout the world. Security is not just about protecting sovereignty, it is also about maintaining the legitimacy of the regime. And so in the interest of time, let me focus a little bit more on national defense and energy production in the context of Asia's role, both in the context of China's role both in Asia as well as in the rest of the world. So China's pursuit of economic and political security has caused it to need to increase or modernize its defenses. These are engines of military modernization. The U.S. may interpret this at times to be expansionist or assertive in terms of looking at China, but if we look at some of the key motivations for China, particularly in the South China Sea, we can't underestimate the importance of energy security. So if I look at sort of general aspects about energy security as it relates to the South China Sea, of course there is significant economic importance, not just to China, but to many of the Asian states in the region. These are major shipping lanes that will transport oil and gas as well as merchandise into the region through the Strait of Malacca. You have 25% of the world's oil, which is also increasing, transported through this area. You have half of the world's global merchandise that transports through this area. You have rich fishing resources, and of course you have the expected oil and gas reserves. Obviously, a big and pressing factor for many states is energy and maintaining energy security into the future. China is already the world's largest energy consumer. It's the second largest oil consumer. It's the largest producer and consumer of coal. China relies very heavily on coal for its economic production and uses about 70% of coal production for energy. Domestic oil fields in China have already peaked. As of 1993, China has become a net oil importer. Natural gas reserves are more viable than oil in some cases in the South China Sea, and the estimates, of course, are varied. So it really depends on who you believe in terms of what the value of the resources that are located there. China also does have shale and natural gas resources that it can tap into, but as I was discussing earlier with somebody, that there are also water shortages that lead to problems with things like fracking and tapping into those shale and gas resources. Energy demands in the region are also growing at about 2.6% a year. Asia is growing from 20% to 30% of global consumption by 2030, and China is expected to represent about 40% of that growth. So all of the states have this vested interest in pursuing greater access to energy. China has looked at energy, of course, in the last 10 years and looked at it in sort of twofold. One, in order to keep the economic machine going, but also some of the impending health and environmental crises that it's dealing with as a result of over-reliance on coal. So the efforts and needs to diversify energy have become very strong for China. This is also then an issue of domestic economic stability, as we can see measured by things like economic growth and seen in the pursuit of energy resources. Asia is not the only place that China has pursued energy diversity, right? We've seen it started to explore more connections in the Middle East, explore pipelines in Central Asia, and has really tried to hedge its bets across all of the different areas, making sure that it can get oil and gas resources from many different actors, making sure that it can work on pipelines, on shipping lanes, making sure that it can engage in renewable energy, nuclear energy, hydroelectric power. I mean, it's really sort of spreading all over the place in order to try to secure its energy future. Keeping in mind, of course, that it's still trying to grow, and currently, of course, this is a pressing problem for them. So what does this tell us then about future security threats in the region and how the United States should respond? China does have pressing energy needs that increase with every single day. And so when you look at some of the tactics China has used in places like the South China Sea, you can see that its more assertive or aggressive posture is also a way that it can garner up support for the regime at home as well. And so you can see efforts to use something we call diversionary theory and rally around the flag syndrome to support a sense of nationalist efforts to secure its energy future. We have to acknowledge and understand that Chinese security interests, what Chinese security interests are, and not just project our own interests onto the Chinese. This is the first step to constructive engagement with China. A second aspect to look at then is China's relationship with its Asian neighbors. And so we can see that China has countered the seeming threat that it has with many of its Asian neighbors by making itself more economically important to them. This was something that we discussed briefly yesterday as well, or the panelists discussed briefly. Economic integration, one could argue, is the key to avoiding war and conflict because it makes everybody a stakeholder. So encouraging greater economic integration is still going to be essential in order to secure to secure China's future in the region. Finally, the third thing to look at is the United States' stance. And again, one of the things that was discussed yesterday was, what role the United States has taken. And so we've seen that the United States' stance has been relatively vague, and part of that is strategic in order to avoid emboldening some of its Southeast Asian neighbors. And I don't know if it's necessary, and this is sort of a difficult part. I'm not advocating that the United States needs to take more of a stance, but I think, as Bob was mentioning, that there has to be sort of a set of rules that are laid out, a set of guidelines that are followed, and then enforced. Taking a clearer position could be helpful to help mediate the situation a bit better. And this could be more desirable than the mixed signals that China continues to get, not just within Asia, but also in other parts of the world. And so an effort to be clear about what the rules are could be very helpful to China, because as we've seen, when push comes to shove, they do try to be that responsible stakeholder. So since Zoellick had sort of proclaimed that China needs to become this responsible stakeholder in the international community, they've tried very hard to join international organizations, to play by the rules that are set out. And so doing more to sort of strengthen international institutions and to create a clear set of rules for China to follow by are also desirable in order to maintain a sense of peace. And so those three aspects, I think, are things that we need to look to in the future in terms of how the United States ought to respond and help encourage China to become more of that responsible stakeholder.
All right, thank you, Dr. Currier. I have one quick, not quick question, but I have one question to pose, and then I think we're going to open this up to question and answer from everybody else. But as I was listening to both of you, I was struck by a couple of things that are interrelated, and they also relate back to comments from yesterday as well, and that is, in economic integration theory, in international politics, we have always made a divide between the so-called high politics of traditional defense military might and low politics of economic policy, trade, those kinds of things. If we look at the European experience, if that is a guideline, if we look at the US-Canada relationship as a guideline, if it can be a guideline, in both of those cases, low politics has been the driving force behind developing a more long-term agenda that produces then security at the high politics level. So my question to you is sort of twofold. Number one is, are we missing the boat? Are we creating an artificial divide between high and low politics on a level? And number two, how does this apply more broadly to the Asian context, this divide between high and low politics, if it does exist?
Yeah, I think it does create an artificial and an unhelpful divide, and I would begin to address that potential problem by getting rid of those two words, high and low. It suggests that the guys that play with guns in some way have a more important role, or they should claim a greater percentage of a country's or a government's national resources, including, of course, budgetary resources. But if I'm right about these other newer or non-traditional security challenges becoming increasingly more important, then I think that will serve to either further make that distinction meaningless. What means for Asia? I think it sort of means for Asia many of the same things it means for the United States. I'd like to go back and reemphasize one thing that Adrian Taylor talked about yesterday. He didn't use this phrase, I don't think, but he talked about the CNN effect. We get all hot and bothered because we see something very visible and very dramatic, frequently on CNN. Islamic extremists are expanding on a map, the ink blots on a map. The Soviets, or not the Soviets, the Russians are going into Ukraine. A Chinese diplomat is making, or a general is making threatening bellicose language directed in one way or another. I think both the Americans and Asians need to figure out how to counter that and how to give equal attention and ample attention to the things that aren't so visible, whether or not it's small increases in global temperatures, whether or not at an early stage it's the appearance of a new type of virus, whether or not it's the breakdown of governance in a particular region, which, if nothing is done about it, may generate a truly humanitarian crisis. So it's not a very good answer, but that's certainly one way I'd start.
I would agree that the divisions are definitely artificial. And so if we look at how sort of our thinking has changed in international relations, going from realism to neo-realism and now moving towards more constructivist or neoliberal institutional kinds of approaches, we see the importance of institutions, and the next step is to strengthen those institutions, right? So we see states sort of looking at institutions as a way to, kind of reshape how they look at the world. And so I think these divisions between high and low politics are clearly artificial, and the quicker we move away from those things, the easier it will be to focus on some of the important issues that are shaping ideas in the region. And how it applies to Asia more specifically, the one thing they have in common is sort of a desire for economic growth. That's what they have in common. Their people are very different, their identities are very different, their security interests are different. And so looking at economics as a way to bind them together makes sense, at least from my perspective, because that's one thing that they share, both in terms of having impressive economic growth within the region, but then also being concerned about continuing that into the future.
All right, thank both of you. We'll go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Again, if you could come forward and state your name and the school you're from or the group you're with.
Hello, my name is Mahen Chilaram, and I attend Clements High School with the Global Studies Academy. And my question is, in alluding to the previous session with Professor Williams' phenomenal point on engaging with the soft touch, how do you think the U.S. can combat these cyber attacks in order to still maintain that soft touch while maintaining the necessary amount of gravitas in order to express our great distaste of these cyber attacks?
That's you.
Okay. Well, I think adroit statesmanship requires, we've used this word in other contexts for the last 2 days, but requires a balance. It's not an either or, it's not soft power or hard power. And I think most of the difficult problems the world faces have to be met with a hint of both. Now, I personally think that frequently the more we publicly talk about, let alone use, hard power, the more difficult it is to deal with many of the challenges we face. But I don't think that we can simply take that off the table. That is almost an aside, really, to your question. What can we do about cyber attacks? I think there's clearly something that's not only in our interest, but it's in the interests of most of the governments of the world. And that is come to a widely agreed upon and respected set of rules governing the use of cyberspace. Now, why do I say it's probably something that would be in the interest of most governments? It's because all governments, all countries are vulnerable. The United States is more vulnerable in some ways simply because we have a more sophisticated and linked or wired economy, but we're less vulnerable than many others because we also have greater ability to counter cyber attacks. Many people believe, and I think there's some compelling evidence, and Carrie may wish to dispute me, but I think there's a lot of reason to think that the Chinese government or the Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army, are engaged in cyber probing and cyber attacks against a whole range of public and private networks in the United States. But as China continues to develop, as their economy continues to grow, they're going to have much greater interest in not being susceptible to such attacks. And so I think in terms of government-to-government levels, creating a code of conduct, rules of the road to govern that behavior, I think, is an important start. Now, where it becomes more difficult, at least to the extent I understand the problem, is when the attacks or the vandalism or the mischief is the result of actions by non-state actors, disgruntled teenagers, bored teenagers, criminals, terrorists. And here I think because all members of the international community or in all governments are equally susceptible to such attacks, again, they have to work together, they have to band together, they have to find a better way than we found so far to share intelligence. We know, for instance, that we are the subject of probes, thousands every day, but we're not too happy about telling the French or the Germans or the Chinese or the Russians how we're able to determine that. So go back to this question of balance, a balance between our ability to collect this intelligence and determine where these probes come from versus our need to share some of this information with other countries and other actors so that we can have a common defense. It's not an easy answer, but if there were easy answers to these questions, then you guys probably would be someplace else today.
I think that pretty much answers it, yeah.
Next question.
Hi, my question was, I guess primarily to Dr. Currier, but Mr. Hathaway, I would appreciate your input as well. Do y'all believe that it is plausible or probable, given the volatile and rocky state of the Chinese domestic politics, that the CCP would resort to inciting an international incident, such as a Taiwan confrontation, to unleash its ace in the hole, as it were, of nationalism, to shore up support and secure its survival as a regime?
I think that any potential conflict with Taiwan would not be desirable for any of the actors involved, for the Chinese, for the Taiwanese, for the United States. If we look at what, I think it was Bob that said it, so the chances for conflict in the region are most likely to be accidental, right? So I don't think that there was any way that the Chinese would try to use scapegoat theory or this, emboldened sense of nationalism just to support themselves. I think in the end what they have to do is to be able to deliver economically. And as time has gone on, they've been able to at least sort of keep the Band-Aid in check, but they haven't been able to necessarily fix some of the pressing economic problems at home. Trying to create or start more conflict abroad would not necessarily be helpful to maintaining economic stability, which I would argue is the key goal. In fact, that could be undermining to economic stability. So in that sense, I don't think it would be desirable, regardless of sort of how the party is doing or how the state is doing.
I absolutely agree. I'll just say one additional thing. I think the Chinese ace in the hole is not nationalism, it's continued economic development. So to the extent you take actions which threatens economic development and growth, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
All right, next question.
Hello, my name is Muhammad and I'm from SFA, and I have a question to the Dr. Hathaway. That what is the best option that the United States, the CIA, the other intelligence can devise, can have to get rid of the Taliban, the militants, especially in Afghanistan, other than the war? Because it's been so long for this war, it is continuous, that the troops are killing the militants and the militants are killing our troops in turn. And what people have seen, and they can perceive that there is no end to this war. So is there any other type of war that we can devise, or other than war, any other option, the best option that we can have to get rid of this? Thank you.
It's a good question for which I have no good answer. If you told Americans in 2001 and 2002 that the Afghanistan was going to prove to be the longest war in American history, they would have looked at you like you'd lost your marbles. And then after we went into Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, and very quickly appeared to have crushed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, so much so that early in 2002, a year before the formal war in Iraq began, early in 2002, we were already diverting important military assets, including, in particular, airborne surveillance, to Iraq, away from Afghanistan. So looking back on it, it's easy to find lots and lots of mistakes we made, which have resulted in 13 years later, the Taliban still being an irritant. They are an irritant to us. Let's not overstate the threat to the United States that the Taliban represents. The Taliban, as we have traditionally defined Taliban, is very much an Afghanistan-focused organization, and it's not even really an organization so much anymore. It's a fragmented collection of groups. I'm going to be giving a lecture in a couple weeks on how in the world we got to this point in Afghanistan and where we're going from there. But I'm not going to give you that lecture today. But I will simply say that with respect to the Taliban, at the end of the day, the Afghans have to deal with and partially defeat and also partially incorporate into the national fabric, including the political fabric of the country, of the Taliban. I would think that if we know anything after 13 years is that the United States simply doesn't have the ability at a cost that it seems reasonable to pay to defeat the Taliban. The Taliban, I expect, will be an irritant to us and more than an irritant to the new government in Kabul for the indefinite future. We can help, we can play a role at the margins with smarter assistance, for instance, development assistance, military assistance. We've spent as much money in Afghanistan on the assistance side as we spent to rebuild all of Europe after the Second World War under the Marshall Plan. And we've got virtually, that's under overstatement, we've got awful little to show for it. Got ready to say virtually nothing, but that's not true. So it's not simply aid, it's smarter aid. So we can play a role at the margins, but I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize that there are problems that other people are better able than we are to deal with. And I would include the Taliban in one of these.
Next question.
I'm from the Global Studies Academy at Clements High School, and I have a question for both the speakers concerning U.S. and China's security interests in the Middle East. So do you think it's possible for the U.S. to negotiate a peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians, given that Israel would return to the pre-1967 borders in exchange for warmer relations with Iran and the disarmament of Hamas and Hezbollah? And if they do so, how would it impact U.S. and China security interests in the region? Thank you.
Would our China expert like to go first?
I'll address the second part of it, sort of, what does it mean for China's security interests in the region? I mean, if you look at China's involvement in the Middle East, they've tried to approach it in a couple of different ways, looking at partnerships based on economic and trade relations, looking at partnerships based on arms transfers, looking at partnerships based on the development of infrastructure, looking at partnerships based on energy. And so the Chinese have really hedged their bets all across the board. They also don't generally take a stance in engaging in other states' affairs. And so one of the benefits for having the Chinese as a partner is they generally allow you to, be left alone. So what happens inside of your own country is your own business, and they keep out of these questions about intervening in state sovereignty. So China will adapt to whatever happens in the Middle East. I think the biggest concern is how much the United States, how big of a role that the U.S. plays in that, and what other states may perceive the U.S.'s role in terms of being either more aggressive or in terms of sort of forcing certain kinds of perspectives. But the Chinese will easily adapt depending on, how their economic interests shape out, and I don't think they would have a problem.
Again, I concur. I don't think China and the United States define their respective national interests in the Middle East in such a way that you can really expect a coordination of effort or partnership for the reasons that Carrie just mentioned. Moreover, I'm very skeptical that the United States, either acting in concert with China, which just said I don't think is likely, or on its own, can beat heads and fashion a enduring peace settlement in the Middle East. Now here I'm talking about part of the world about which I know nothing, but I would simply say that many U.S. administrations from both political parties have devoted a huge amount of effort and time and political capital, and they failed. And until the Israelis and the Palestinians and the other people in the region find it's in their own interest to have an enduring peace settlement, I don't think there's very little we can do to impose one on the region, with or without China.
We probably have time for 2 more questions. So. Please.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Brenner. I am from Clements High School. We're a very curious bunch. So my question kind of is more of it's an expansion on Rami's last question. Knowing Israel's military and how everyone is required to perform at least some sort of military service, and knowing that Jewish men and women all around the world can be eligible to participate and serve in the Israeli military, is it possible for that to change potentially, or for it to become a way? I'm trying to rephrase my question because it's not really making sense. Is if there is a chance for this conflict, impossible conflict, to be resolved, is there a potential way for Israelis to, the Israeli military service to kind of take a little bit less of an intensity? If you understand what
I'm not sure how to answer.
Yeah. I think neither one of us has paid any particular attention to the Middle East, and while we probably both have personal opinions, I don't think that they're anything other than simply personal opinions. So if you want to, I'll be happy to talk offline with you about it, but I'm not sure that I'm qualified to pontificate and bore everybody else.
If I can make one little comment on that area and violate my role as moderator for just a second, but it's an intriguing question. And since I actually teach our course on Middle East politics at SFA, there are ways to get out of that military service requirement in Israel. The extent to which that required service impacts the way I understand your question, much like we have talked about on this panel already, my two esteemed colleagues on this panel have talked about it. If you have, and I think Adrian Taylor made reference to this yesterday too, if you have military force, there's a tendency to want to use it, kind of thing. And I guess that's sort of where you're getting at with that question, is that? My read of the situation is whether or not there's required military service is a marginal impact on the broader dynamic, you know. And so if there is required military service, if there's not, if people living outside of the current state of Israel who are Jewish can participate in that or not, I think that's so minimal in the impact that it actually has on the overall conduct of the relationship between Israel and its neighbors, Israel and the Palestinian population. Yeah, that would be my quick answer on that. Okay, but good question. One more.
Hi, my name is Lynn Tui. I'm from Clements High School. So, Mr. Hathaway, you mentioned earlier that we should consider non-traditional threats to security and that climate change is one of them. So, how do you believe that we can combat climate change and global warming while still considering the development in developing countries?
Boy, that could be the toughest question we've had to date. I don't have good answers. I'm convinced that until we are able to address the question of equity, we're not going to get very far in a global sense. Those countries which until recently have not been high-growth countries correctly point to the industrialized Western world and say, you guys are responsible for the greenhouse gases and for all the crap in the air. Do something about it. The economically developed world says, well, China and India are two of the three biggest problems today. If we, the industrialized West, do something about it and you all don't do anything about it, it's not going to make any difference. That's a very serious issue for which I've never seen a good answer, other than the fact that this is what you have diplomats for and statesmen for. Part of the solution is going to have to require all people in all countries and all governments to make sacrifices. And at least this government in this country is very good about telling other people in other countries they have to sacrifice, but not nearly as good about asking American citizens to sacrifice. And American citizens are very good about thinking other guys should cut back their carbon emissions. But for crying out loud, don't raise our gasoline prices to make it more, to discourage gasoline consumption. It's going to take an awful lot of statesmanship, both within each country and at the global level, before people are generally convinced that everybody has to make sacrifices, including and particularly perhaps people who enjoy the highest standards of living.
All right, let's thank our panelists for our... Dr. Murphy.